So I'm here to talk about data culture. I'm looking at data from an emotional standpoint because I'm an artist and I care about how people feel. But I'm also implementing these projects technically so that we can learn from the experiences of building things and carry them all the way through to how people feel. So I'm trying to close a feedback loop. And I have to say that this morning I went to register my son for school and I had to fill out an emergency card. And on the front of the emergency card I had to put his name. And then I flipped the card around and guess what? On the back I had to put his name again. So this reminds me that data culture is not very far yet. We haven't quite understood how data works, right? We haven't understood that if the same card on the front has the same information as on the back, well, why do we have to write it twice? Please explain this to me. Has anybody here heard about a database? I don't think so. So we add information to systems redundantly so often it drives me crazy. But anyways, there's another problem with data culture, which is that it's really not yet a culture. And if I look at this picture here, I took this on a hike, and this is an image for me of culture, because we have landscape that is clearly not culture, it's the world, right? But then this path is what we draw into the landscape, and that's what makes it culture. It's the way we relate to the environment we live in. What do we need to do in order to be comfortable in the world we live in? We constantly have to change that because the world around us constantly changes, and so data is a key part in figuring out how the world changes. And figuring out where that path should go and so forth. But culture is a very broad concept that allows us to adapt to our environment. So opposed to that is in a way expertise. And here's a picture of the same fellow you saw earlier having an orange juice with his sister. And this is something they do by themselves, right? I'm out of this system. Here they are sharing some kind of expertise. It has something to do with how much bubbles you can blow into the cup or something. And I was not part of that story. I was sitting there, but I was left on the outside. And that's exactly the feeling I think many people have when they look at data science today. They feel like, well, what these people are doing things in corporations like Google and so forth with data that we don't quite understand, and we know that somehow it leads to less spam, but we don't quite know how to trust it because it's an expertise practice, right? It's an expertise that we can't break into. So the culture around data doesn't really exist yet. And let's look at why. Thank you for that slide, by the way. A wonderful example. So this is a beautiful system 5 of showing how expertise might be scaled, right? But it is still an expertise. And what I think is missing is the whole cultural layer on top of it. So how can we unpack this a little bit? What do we need to do? We need to think of a feedback loop. And here I'm talking about teaching and about online education. I'm talking about how a student takes an action. The action produces some kind of data in something like a grade, perhaps, an outcome, and that grade is shared with some kind of community. And ideally, it's the imagination around that data and around that community that leads the student to do better next time. So the way we implement this is in a example like here. We have an engagement index. Or this is taken from my students this morning. One of my students has an engagement index of 1,974. Another one has an index of 0. Another one has an index of, where was there? Well, there's another 0 here. This one here is in 687. And so it's interesting data for me as a teacher, but the real question is, how does it feel for the student? And how do we figure out how these people, this Mr. 687 here, how he's going to do something to get to 1,987, right? So the question is, how can we take action based on this data? We measure a lot of things, but can the people who are measured take action, or are they a passive subject in this equation? How can they become active? How can they say, oh, because my situation is like this, I'm going to have to change it? Certain kinds of behavior. Well, back to this slide here, imagination is crucial. If the guy with 687 points sees this his role in the community and wants to change it, he has to have some kind of imagination about what to do to increase the action, to get better data, and then to be a different kind of member of the community he's in. Now, in the case of a class, this is a very tight feedback loop. But in the case of air quality, this is very complicated because air quality is both local and global, and it's both we're both sources of pollution, but we're also exposed to pollution that we didn't generate. So There's a lot of issues about compassion there, and there's a lot of issues about who's measuring about whom. So if I go out into a community and as a scientist and say, hey, guess what? You have lots of particulate matters in here in the morning when you go to work. They're not going to be very happy about that because it's another professor from UC Berkeley telling them how their life sucks. And that's not good enough because they need to figure out with their imagination what they can do about their situation, right? They need to be able to take action. We can't scale solutions and we can't tell people what to do. We can, however, inspire people with tools to figure out what solutions they might want to pursue themselves. And so this goes back to 2007. We had a project called Black Cloud, where with a group of students in South Central Los Angeles and other places. This was in an orphanage here, far away. But in a high school in Los Angeles, we studied how people respond to a sensor that doesn't tell them what it's about. It had no information. It just responded and changed in interesting ways. And then we had the sensors broadcast information via Twitter, and the students responded via Twitter, and they started looking for these boxes in their neighborhoods. It was a complex game, but it was all about connecting the data with the imagination. So in the end, they wrote things like they're looking for a sensor box. They're trying to figure out what it does. There's a big mystery. They don't know what it does. And I couldn't find the box in the place I went to, and they have interesting typography. And they said, I had a dream, and this is crucial, right? So they deal with this after a while. This is July 23rd. A week later, they started imagining things. They said, I had a dream. It was a very dark place. I see the eyes of the black cloud staring as if it was trying to give me some kind of message, right? So they're starting now to dream about data. And that's where we want to be. That's where culture happens. Culture happens where people dream about possible futures and about how they can achieve those possible futures. And ultimately, that's nothing less than freedom. So then, later on, another one writes, hi everyone, in first section, this was a group of students in high school. I was wondering if you guys are online so we can predict tomorrow. I don't want to do it by myself. That's another key point of data culture, is that culture is communal, it's shared. And it's not that we fight for ourselves, it's that together we try to find solutions. And we don't want to go to the future ourselves, we want to go together. So, to tie this together, in addition to the data feedback loop, we need to look at an emotional feedback loop. We need to ask the student, how does it feel? We have to come to terms with why we did what we did. Why did I book that flight to Fiji if I knew that the world was so polluted? Why did I do what I did? And then, what does the data mean? And what kind of people are we as a community? And finally, what future do I want and how do I want to contribute? And if we do all that, maybe we get to data culture. And remember the orange juice picture from early on with the kids sucking their orange juice themselves? Well, of course, there's a whole culture around orange juice, and it looks like this. So instead of going from the expertise where we have a little straw, where we do our own thing in our own world, we go to a whole culture where there's postcards, there's aesthetics, there's presses, there's tools by which we can do our own thing. And I'm speaking metaphorically here, right? Of course, we have some of these tools, but they're not as broadly shared as the culture around orange juice is. So this is a way to illustrate there is now an orange juice culture. Imagine what a data culture would look like. It would have all these expressions and many, many more, and everybody would be able to use that data culture to help determine their future and thereby their freedom. Thank you.